few years ago, Anderson Cooper was hosting a panel on CNN with a group of commentators who were discussing the news that the body of a victim missing for weeks had finally been found. One of the panelists said, "I'm so glad that the police were able to recover the body so that the victim's family can finally now have closure." Anderson immediately objected and said, "Closure is just a made-up media word. There's no such thing as closure." He was speaking from the pain of his own personal experiences. His father died when he was only 10. His brother took his own life. And just before this panel occurred, his mother had died as well. Anderson had become so well acquainted with grief that he had come to jettison and get rid of any belief in the idea of closure. Cooper's objection to closure may be a challenge to us because as human beings, we desperately desire resolution. This is the reason whenever we're struggling with grief over the loss of someone or something we loved, a child, a spouse, a parent, a marriage, a relationship, a job, we inevitably hear people say things like, "You need to move on now. You need to let it go. You need to get over it. You need to find closure." We want life to be neat and tidy. We want it to follow a logical progression and have a clear beginning and end. And we expect people to control their feelings. Unfortunately, emotions don't usually work that way, especially grief, which defies our desire for control, order, logic, or simplicity. Grief can be quite inconvenient, and many have found that there are certain kinds of losses which remain ambiguous forever. In fact, most of the losses that are life-altering consistently evade the possibility of closure. But what if closure is not the goal of grief? One of the saints of our church, Sarah Bryant, used her charm and tenacity to establish the first Planned Parenthood in North Carolina with a red telephone in her home, where she answered calls 24 hours a day, requests from women all over the country in need of reproductive health. One day I was visiting Sarah in her home, and she showed me a picture of her late husband, Bob, hanging on the wall. And she said, "Every night before I go to sleep, I talk to Bob. I tell him about my day, and I say, 'Good night, love,' as if he is right here with me." I thought it was very sweet, but I have to mention, I was also a little worried about her. Was she in denial? Was she grieving appropriately? Is it healthy to talk to the dead as if they're still here with us? What would people think if she started talking to Bob at Harris Teeter? Someone might get worried or concerned. Since then, I've come to realize that I should have been more concerned with my own narrow spiritual and emotional capacity in that moment. As a pastor who prays to a living God, preaches about a resurrected Jew, and celebrates All Saints' Day, why was I struggling with someone talking to their husband beyond the grave? When we encounter Jesus in Luke 20, he's been assailed by accusations about his authority and peppered with questions from the chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees who were laying traps to try to get him to say something incriminating so that they could have justification that they needed to dismiss him or to kill him. And I can only imagine how exhausted Jesus was from defending himself from the onslaught of his attackers. When who should show up then, finally, to try and take him down but the Sadducees? Sadducees were men of high social standing from the upper socioeconomic echelon of Judean society who served as the authorities of the temple in Jerusalem and were responsible for its maintenance. They oversaw the formal administrative affairs of the state, such as collecting taxes and leading the army, regulating relations with the Roman Empire, mediating domestic grievances. Sadducees were the bureaucracy, and they were known for their corruption. Theologically, though, they did not believe in spirits, angels, the afterlife, or the resurrection. In some ways, they were the prototype of a materialist political leader who uses their religious authority to hide their self-interested political aims. They asked Jesus, if a woman was married to every son in a family of 7 brothers who all died, and yet she bore no children to any of them, who would she belong to in the afterlife? It says in the Greek. The question was not only absurd and highly improbable, it also reflected a patriarchal worldview that saw women as the property of their husbands. Remember, the Sadducees didn't actually believe in the resurrection, so their question was an attack on Jesus' own theology. They were not only taking a sarcastic swipe at the idea of the resurrection, they were also assuming that the property rights that people have here on earth extend into the afterlife. Their real agenda was to protect their own property through the practice of levirate marriage that forced widows to marry the brother of their late husband in order to survive in a patriarchal world. And Jesus was having none of this. He said to those Sadducees, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those considered worthy of a place in the resurrection neither marry or are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and children of God. For a minute, let's try to overlook in this passage the way that Jesus casually compared marriage to death, so that we can try to see what he's really saying. Marriage is an earthly institution, and any rights or privileges that come with it do not carry on into the afterlife. And I'm sure this was great news to the followers of Jesus who were women, who were likely standing around hearing this conversation and saying, well, at last I'll be free and equal when I'm dead. But there's an important point that might be lost in translation. Marriage may be a temporal earthly institution that does not carry on, but that does not mean that the relationships we create here on earth end with death. Jesus went on to say, now God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to God all of them are alive. The British psychologist John Bowlby studied loss and grief in children and adults for most of his career, and he discovered that people who find a way to hold continuing bonds with their loved ones after they have died are mentally stronger and have a healthier grieving process. He wrote, it's precisely because these widows and widowers that he studied were willing for their feelings of attachment with the dead to persist that their sense of identity was preserved. The reorientation of their relationship with their loved one enabled them to reorganize their lives along new, meaningful lines. It turns out that people who grieve like Sarah Bryant, by keeping their loved ones alive, have an easier and a healthier journey. In her book, The Myth of Closure, a renowned researcher on death and dying, Pauline Boss, who coined the term ambiguous loss, writes, our loved ones are gone and yet they're still here. They are both absent and present to us. It's a paradox. The contradictions of that paradox can be eased, if not resolved, by the fact that we can discover new ways of being with them, new ways of relating with those who are dead and lost to us. Research shows that we do better to live with grief than to deny it. And continuing to use the word closure actually perpetuates the myth that losses and grief have a prescribed time for ending, and that it's somehow emotionally healthy to close the door on suffering rather than to face it and learn how to live with it. In March of 1994, a 47-year-old woman living in Maine made the momentous decision to quit her job, to pile her essential belongings into an old Subaru, and head out to Colorado to live closer to a monk named Rafe. That woman was author and mystic Cynthia Bourgeault. And Rafe became her teacher and mentor, and she calls him her soulmate. They had no romantic relationship, but in her book, Love is Stronger Than Death, Cynthia describes how when Rafe died of a massive heart attack a few years after she moved to be with him, the living phase of their love for each other came to an abrupt end, yet somehow her relationship with him remained. She writes, I continued to experience an unfolding connection with Rafe that was new. It was not as if I were simply remembering what he taught me or even channeling his presence. Rather, we were doing exactly what we had done during our human life together, bushwhacking a path into the unknown, through the fire of our yearning and the depth of our trust. Jesus told the Sadducees that the very name of God contains the reality of a relationship that transcends death. We worship the God of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, who were all long dead when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush. According to Jesus, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, because all the dead are already and always alive to God. A relationship continues. It transcends death. And this is the profound mystery that we come to celebrate together on All Saints Sunday. Saints are not only martyrs who died for the faith, or just the good people who died before us, the heroes of history, or those who died as Christians or church members or faithful witnesses. The saints are those that we choose to commune with, even after they have died and left this world. The people we choose to continue a relationship with, they are our ancestors, our loved ones, our friends, our family, who we continue to experience and continue to commune with long after they are gone. The tradition of honoring our ancestors exists in almost every indigenous culture on earth. So there is deep and ancient spiritual wisdom in remembering the cloud of witnesses who surround us and strengthen us on our journeys. But if we can learn anything from the cultures who came before us, who venerate their ancestors, it is that honoring our ancestors requires something of us. Requires intention and action, rituals of veneration, practices of care that embody an ongoing relationship after death. We cannot simply assume that our ancestors who are looking down on us will offer us their aid automatically. Tradition teaches that we have to actively call upon them. We have to invite them to come into our lives. We have to talk to them, spend time with them, journey with them, and develop a new relationship with them as we would any person who is living on this earth. That is how we keep our ancestors alive. The good news of All Saints is that we are never alone. We are surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses, and we have to act like it. A few months ago, I met with one of my mentors, Maida Commerce, who is an author, healer, and practitioner of what she calls story medicine. We sat together on a patio outside a small grocery store and just talked about life and work and what we need to survive in these days. At one point, Maida stopped the conversation because she was sensing something in her spirit. She looked down at the ground and then up at the sky, and then she looked me right in the face and she said, "Ben, something dangerous is coming for you." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. When a black woman elder who is deeply in tune with the Spirit tells you something is coming for you, you have to listen. You better listen. Then she said, you need to call on all your ancestors and invite them to come and help you and protect you. I didn't know what to say. I was overwhelmed. I tried to deflect the heaviness of this words by being a smart aleck, and I said, but I don't trust my ancestors. She didn't laugh. She said, no, you've got to call on ancestors so far back in history, you don't even know their names, because that's who you need right now to be with you in this moment. So I took a deep breath and went home and built an altar. Someone had given me a painting of Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Aretha Franklin, Mahalia Jackson, and Marian Anderson, and I put that at the center. Someone had given me a figurine of James Baldwin. I put that on the altar. I had an old newspaper clipping about my grandfather when he was called to his first church, a 6-point charge in New Kent, Virginia. I had a good picture of Carlisle Marnie to add as well. I lit some candles, and I invited my ancestors to come. Every one of us in this sanctuary today is grieving someone or something. Many are grieving the loss of a loved one, a relationship, a job, a way of life, a past that felt more comfortable and enjoyable than the present. Others are grieving the loss of rights or the loss of America as we knew it. Others are still grieving losses that have come from the pandemic, the unfathomable sickness and death of millions of our fellow Americans. There has been no closure from these ambiguous losses that we have suffered over these past years. We have barely begun to process what this has meant for us, for our minds, for our bodies, for our souls, for our church, for our nation. We are divided as a people, and yet we've never needed each other more. We are grieving, and yet we are also in denial. We feel alone, and yet we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are haunted by the ghosts of the past, and yet we've never needed our ancestors more. What should we do in this moment, in these times? We must call on all our ancestors. The question is, can we fight that urge to believe that death is the end? Can we believe that love is stronger than death? Are we willing to do the work that is needed to keep our ancestors alive? Mahan Seiler, the former pastor of Pullen Church in Raleigh, recently told me a story about a time he was at the bedside of a man who was dying, and the man said, "Mahan, you've conducted a lot of funerals in your day. What do you say to someone, what do you say at these funerals about people who've died?" Taking a deep breath, Mahan replied, "Love never ends." After a long pause, the man said, "Maybe so." Maybe so was good enough for Mahan for a long time, but when his son, Marshall, took his own life at the age of 54, he found he needed something more than maybe so. His grief was all-consuming. And then a couple of weeks after Marshall's death, a gift came. Early in the morning, before sunrise, he experienced Marshall. In a vivid and compelling Technicolor dream, Marshall was standing at the head of a table where Mahan was surrounded by his family, but only Marshall was visible, up close and intimate. He radiated well-being, cheeks with color, soft eyes, an engaging smile, all of him exuding health, a contrast to those stressful last months where his inner light flickered and outer life contracted. And in the dream, Mahan recalls that Marshall extended his arms toward him with an inviting gesture, saying, "Let's give thanks. Let's give thanks." A few days after Marshall's death, a neighbor shocked Mahan with a creation. He'd carved a 6-foot trunk of a tree on their main road into a dynamic deer, leaping from its hind feet, soaring to new heights. It was a gift to Mahan, and this sculpture became for him an icon of his son, Marshall. Mahan has written, "Some who grieve return to the grave of their loved one. I return to this icon. It has become an opening into our ongoing relationship that transcends the bounds of death." Mahan calls these encounters with Marshall visitations and asks the question, does not the experience of love never ends include the grace of continuing relationships with loved ones beyond the grave like Marshall? Perhaps it's time for us to sit at the feet of our ancestors, including indigenous ancestors who assumed the presence and the guidance available for them from those who've passed beyond this realm. My two practices, he said, are the pilgrimage to the icon of Marshall and the invitation, let's give thanks. And they unite me with Marshall in our shared transformation of becoming more fully the love that transcends death. On this All Saints Sunday, we come together to ask ourselves, who are the saints that we need to call upon? Who are the witnesses that we need to invite to be with us today? Who are the ancestors we need to keep alive at this moment in our lives, at this moment in our history? Who is our Bob, our Rafe, our Marshall that we need to connect with Is there someone waiting for us to reestablish a connection, to build an ongoing relationship that transcends the bounds of death? We serve a living God. We follow a risen Savior. Our Creator is the one who communes with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. People die, but the connection remains. Institutions die, but relationships live on. For neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all of creation, Paul says, will ever be able to separate us from the love of our God or our love for each other. Because love is stronger than death. This is the good news for us today and every day, so long as we are willing to work to keep our ancestors alive. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Our ancestors are waiting for us to call upon them and invite them into our lives. We are never alone. And now we just have to live like it. Amen.